Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Week 3 of the war, it keeps getting worse. Israel has struck multiple targets in Gaza in what's being called the deadliest round of bombing so far. In all, more than 5,000 people have been killed in Gaza, more than 15,000 injured. Aid has started trickling through the Rafah border, but it's far from adequate. India too has sent 6 tons of aid to Palestinians. Israel's Western allies have asked it to adhere to international law and protect civilians. Meanwhile, China has deployed 6 warships in the region. We'll tell you what they're up to. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS have called on their supporters to attack Israelis and Americans everywhere. Like I said, it keeps getting worse whichever way you look at it. In Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif is back. We'll bring you the speeches, the drama and the latest developments. In the South China Sea, 2 ships have collided, one from China, the other from the Philippines. Needless to say, tensions are high. In India, 10 deaths in 24 hours due to heart attacks at Garba events. India's foreign minister has lashed out at Canada. And women in Iceland, including their Prime Minister, are striking work tomorrow. We'll tell you why. The headlines first. Sweden moves a step closer to joining NATO. The Turkish President, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has submitted Stockholm's bid to the country's parliament. For 1 year, Ankara had blocked Sweden's move, citing security concerns. It withdrew its objections only in July. China is probing iPhone maker Foxconn. It comes weeks after its founder, Terry Gou, announced his bid for Taiwan's presidency. Gou has said that he won't be pressured by Beijing. The Taiwanese firm is China's largest private sector employer and one of Apple's biggest suppliers. Will France sell Rafale fighter jets to Saudi Arabia? Paris says talks are underway. Riyadh reportedly wants a cost estimate of 54 Rafales by November. France is the world's 3rd biggest arms exporter after the US and Russia. The Iranian teenager who was allegedly assaulted by the morality police is brain dead. This incident took place earlier this month on the Tehran metro. The 16-year-old had slipped into coma after a reported face-off over the hijab law. The case is similar to that of Masha Amini, who died in the custody of the same morality police in September last year. The Kenyan shilling sinks to a record low of 150 against the dollar. In the last year, the currency has plunged by almost 24%. The shilling has been in decline for several years now. Kenya has a debt of over $67 billion. Denmark's deputy prime minister resigns, saying he is leaving politics. It comes just months after he returned from a 6-month leave due to stress. He's also stepping down as the leader of his party, which is part of Denmark's ruling coalition. And Saudi Arabia launches the Esports World Cup. The competition will be held annually in Riyadh starting next summer. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has invested heavily in this sector. He's said to be an avid gamer himself, partial to Call of Duty. It's day 17 of the war and the 3rd week of the war. And the big update is this: things are getting worse. Israeli airstrikes continue on Gaza. In fact, yesterday night was the most violent yet. Around 400 people were killed. Yet there is no sign of the ground invasion. The troops are ready. The machinery is ready, but the green signal has not come. So tonight, we're looking at 5 questions. Hopefully, they'll explain where the conflict stands right now. Question number 1, what is the situation inside Gaza? In 2 words, really bad. Israel claims to have struck 320 targets in 24 hours. 320 targets in 24 hours. This includes Hamas launch pads and command centers. They've also released footage of these attacks. Take a look. Of course, it wasn't just Hamas targets. A number of civilian targets were also hit, like in Khan Yunis. It's a city located in southern Gaza, just about 15 kilometers from the border crossing at Rafah. Technically, it's a safe zone, but on Sunday, it was pounded. People there called it the worst night since the war began.
We're told that Khan Yunis is considered to be a safe place, and everyone came here, from the north or from Gaza City, because it is considered safe. But unfortunately, last night was the hardest night so far we saw in Khan Yunis.
The death toll keeps rising. It has crossed 5,000 in Gaza. Reports say around 40% of the fatalities are children. Injuries are also rising. More than 15,000 Gazans are wounded. Hospitals there have been overrun by patients, which brings us to aid. There is good news and bad news on that front. The good news is that aid is moving. Around 3 aid convoys have entered the Gaza Strip. More trucks should follow soon. And the bad news? It's nowhere enough. The United Nations says the current aid is just 4% of the pre-war average. It's hard to explain Gaza's situation in words, so we'll use a video instead. It's from Gaza City in the north. Look at the situation after an Israeli airstrike there. Question number 2. What is Israel's next move? Their Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a busy weekend. He first visited Israel's border with Lebanon. He spoke to soldiers stationed there. Netanyahu broadly outlined his plan for Gaza. This is what he said.
We're in a battle for our lives, a battle for our home. This is not an exaggeration. This is the war. It's do or die. They need to die. And we are now in a double battle. One battle is a battle to hold action here, and on the other side, to win there, an absolute victory that will erase Hamas.
A battle to erase Hamas. That seems to be Israel's end game here, to end Hamas's rule in the Gaza Strip. Of course, this means invading by ground. Hamas has taken up positions deep inside Gaza. You cannot flush them out with airstrikes alone. A ground operation will be necessary. The question is, when will it start? After visiting the northern border, Netanyahu convened his war cabinet. All his top officials were present, the army chief, the Mossad chief, and the Shin Bet chief. Now, they hold the key to the next stage of this war. A few limited raids have already been carried out in Gaza. Israeli soldiers entered several meters into Gazan territory. What was their mission? Find hostages and drive out terrorists. Hamas fired back at the Israelis. They claimed the IDF soldiers fled the area. Now, this was not a full-scale incursion, but it was a sneak peek.
The IDF forces raided Gaza today, close to the border, as part of the effort to prepare the space for an attack following information on the missing and abducted, a top priority of national mission. During one of the raids, an IDF fighter was killed and 3 fighters were wounded.
The real invasion would be much uglier. Israel has talked about a long and tough war. And on Sunday, their defense minister mentioned a vague timeline. He said it could take 1, 2, or 3 months. Whichever it is, their objective seems clear now. Remove Hamas from Gaza. And frankly, Israel does not have a choice. After the brutality of Hamas's attack, no country can let them stay in power. But how they do it is a different issue altogether. And that's linked to our third question. What are Israel's allies up to? Well, the solidarity visits continue. On Saturday, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni visited Israel. Today, the Dutch Prime Minister is visiting, and tomorrow, the French President, President Emmanuel Macron, is going to Israel. But is that solidarity equal to support? Well, at first, Western leaders gave Israel a long rope. But that seems to be changing. They haven't used the word ceasefire yet, but all the indications are there. Meloni warned Israel against falling into what she calls Hamas's trap. Meanwhile, the EU foreign policy chief called for a humanitarian pause.
This was the real objective of Hamas attack, not to defend the right of the Palestinian people, but to force a reaction against Gaza that would undermine any attempt at dialogue and create an unfillable gap between Arab countries, Israel and the West.
Personally, I think that a humanitarian pause is needed in order to allow the humanitarian support to come into and being distributed. I think that half of the population of Gaza has been moving from their houses.
Leaders of the West also had a virtual meeting on Sunday. It was attended by 6 leaders: Joe Biden of the US, Justin Trudeau of Canada, French President Macron, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. 6 leaders. At the end of it, they released a joint statement. And this is what they said. The leaders reiterated their support for Israel and its right to defend itself against terrorism and called for adherence to international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians. So the support is still there, but it's not endless support. What explains this change in stance? Our next 2 questions should answer that. Question number 4, what's the situation on the northern front? The one with Lebanon. Much more tense. Israel has struck 20 Hezbollah sites in Lebanon. They also hit airports in Syria's Damascus and Aleppo. Both airports were shut down. The exchanges are more frequent now. Israel has also evacuated border cities. It's preparing for the worst. If Hezbollah joins the war, things could spiral out of control. Netanyahu warned them against it. He said Israel would hit back with quote-unquote unimaginable force. So it is a major worry. A wider war will draw in Western countries. It will also increase oil prices. Western leaders are keen to avoid that. Question number 5. What's been the global response? Well, pro-Palestine protests continue. Last week, we showed you the demonstrations in the Muslim world. Now look at the Western cities. In Denmark, hundreds gathered in their capital, Copenhagen. They held up Palestinian flags and shouted slogans. They marched to the Danish parliament in solidarity. Same in Boston. Hundreds of protesters gathered at the city's Copley Square and they had posters saying "Free Palestine." This is Boston.
We want 48! We want 48! We are all Palestinians! We are all Palestinians! In our thousands, in our millions! We are all Palestinians!
In Germany, things got a bit violent. There was an unauthorized pro-Palestine rally in Berlin. The police had to break it up eventually. They also arrested several protesters. In Paris, around 15,000 protesters turned up. Some of them climbed up to statues and waved Palestinian flags. And unlike the rally in Berlin, this one was authorized. If you thought that was big, well, wait for London. 100,000 pro-Palestine protesters marched through the British capital. Let me repeat that. 100,000, 1 lakh protesters. They held up banners and chanted slogans against Israel. These pictures will have an impact. We've already seen countries drawing red lines for Israel. Even India said civilian casualties are a point of concern. New Delhi has also shipped aid to Gaza. An Indian Air Force plane landed in Egypt on Sunday. It was carrying 6 tons of medical aid, plus 32 tons of relief material. So the ball is now in Israel's court. If they push further, they could lose foreign support. If they don't push, they could lose domestic support. There are no easy choices here. But in war, there rarely is. So West Asia is like a tinderbox right now. Multiple stakeholders, heavily armed and not shy of using force. It is a volatile cocktail of violence and politics. What could make it worse? Try Chinese warships, because they're already there, 6 of them. The PLA, the Chinese army, has sent 6 warships to West Asia. It's not clear when they arrived, but last week they made their presence known. A Chinese naval task force was spotted in the Gulf. It had 3 warships, 1 destroyer, 1 frigate and 1 supply ship. Together, they were a task force. And this task force made 2 stops, Oman and Kuwait. Now, these ships had some serious firepower. The destroyer is what China calls the Zibo. It can launch guided missiles. It also has advanced radar and electronic equipment. Their last stop was Muscat, the capital of Oman. We cannot confirm where they are or where they went after that. So that's one team with 3 ships. Now let's tell you about the second one, the second group. Again, 3 warships. They were spotted earlier this month. They escorted a cargo ship from Panama. Their current status is not clear, but by all accounts, all these ships have not left the region. In other words, as the war between Israel and Hamas escalates, China has 6 warships in West Asia. What are they doing there? Fueling a lot of speculation, among other things. Experts are describing and discussing a range of possibilities as to why they're there, like the evacuation of Chinese citizens. That's being held out as one possibility, but it makes little sense because Beijing is not evacuating its citizens. Yes, it has asked Chinese nationals to leave Israel, but it's not arranging any chartered flights for them. China has told its citizens to, quote-unquote, find their own way home. Also, you don't need 6 warships to bring your people to safety. Another possibility is cargo protection, using ships for escort missions, securing the shipping lanes, keeping the goods flowing. And it's a more likely explanation at this point because oil supply is Beijing's biggest worry right now. It is a net importer of crude oil. 72% of oil used in China is imported. More than half of it comes from West Asia. Out of every 3 barrels of oil that China consumes, 1 comes from West Asia. For countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, China is their biggest buyer of oil. And now this supply is at risk from the war. Also remember, China's economy is already in a bad shape. The last thing they want is to be short of oil. So Beijing is actively trying to contain the war. Last week, it sent a peace envoy to the region, a man called Zai Jun, a veteran Chinese diplomat. Today, he was in the UAE.
Special Envoy Zai Jun plans to continue to visit the Middle East to strengthen coordination with relevant parties on promoting a ceasefire, stopping the violence and cooling down the situation. We will continue to release relevant news in a timely manner.
And this is the assessment from the envoy himself, Zai Jun. He says the situation in Gaza is quote-unquote very serious. He's called for an immediate ceasefire and also offered to broker peace, but he's found no takers yet. So he's turned to the United Nations, asking them to step in. Zai has called for an international conference to end the war. China wants the United Nations to play the role of a mediator. Now remember, all of this is happening far away from China's traditional sphere of influence. This is West Asia, traditionally America's strategic playground. But China has waded in and made strides of late. It successfully mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia, both key suppliers of oil to Beijing. It was a win-win for all sides. And since then, Xi Jinping has hinted at another mission, trying to settle the Israel-Palestine question. But this war is exposing the limits of China's diplomacy. And China is not the only one. Some other players are also trying to elbow their way into the conflict. Terror groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Reports say these groups and their numerous affiliates are thrilled with what's happening. They've congratulated Hamas for the October 7th attack. And that's not even the worst part of it. Here's what is. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are encouraging people to launch attacks. On whom? Israelis, Americans, and Jewish people everywhere. They're asking their supporters to attack them. It is shameless opportunism. The crisis in Gaza is obviously evoking sympathy for the many innocent Palestinians who are caught in the crossfire, and groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS want to capitalize on this. They want to radicalize and recruit people into their cause, even if that cause is unrelated, let alone nefarious. Al-Qaeda and ISIS have very little to do with Palestine. Yes, they have some nominally affiliated groups active in Gaza, but overall, they've steered clear of the Palestinian issue. You see, ISIS was too busy killing and maiming people while trying to carve out their kingdom. and Al-Qaeda concentrated on its endless terror attacks. Palestine never figured in their scheme of things. But now two Al-Qaeda affiliates have turned their attention to Israel, Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM. Al-Shabaab is based in Somalia in East Africa. It has between 7,000 to 12,000 members, according to the United Nations. The AQIM reportedly had about 10,000 members spread across North and West Africa, but their numbers have been dwindling since. So they're now cheering Hamas and asking their people to join in on the attack. Same with the ISIS. They reportedly have anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000 members in Syria and Iraq, nothing compared to their peak, or indeed compared to the Hezbollah and their 100,000 fighters. These terror groups are now so small that Israel may not even view them as a serious threat, at least not compared to Hamas and Hezbollah. They're bigger fish to fry. But these groups are circulating hateful rhetoric. They're propagating violence, and that's where the danger lies. Because days after the Hamas attack, a teacher was killed in France. The attacker had apparently sworn allegiance to ISIS. A few days later, a 45-year-old killed 2 Swedish people in Brussels, Belgium. Authorities took him out after a manhunt. They say he was radicalized. And this is the real danger with calls from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the whole basket of terror groups. They encourage lone wolf attacks. That's where one individual with little material support goes on a rampage. He or she is a lone wolf. These attacks are some of the most difficult to stop because the attacker is acting alone. They usually leave little to no evidence about their plans. And that makes it difficult for intelligence agencies to prevent such attacks. Groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda want to promote this. It's their way of outsourcing terror. The other thing they want is more recruits. They want more people to join them. And that's why they pretend to care about Palestine. They hope that by showing this support, they can attract the interest of some Palestinian supporters. Most of them may ignore these terror groups, but some people may be too angry to understand the game. Security agencies around the world are wary of this threat. But remember, whatever they claim, these terror groups do not care about the Palestinian cause. The only cause they further is their own. And the only goal they chase is death and destruction. In Pakistan, the comeback man is back again. I'm talking about Nawaz Sharif. After all the speculation, he's finally returned home. And what drama it was. Sharif was welcomed at the Lahore airport by his younger brother, that's Shehbaz Sharif. The two then headed to a massive rally in Lahore. No cars or motorcades though. The Sharifs took a helicopter to this rally. And once there, it was like a soap opera. Nawaz Sharif broke down while hugging his daughter on stage, and above them was a fireworks display. Take a look. Family reunion done, it was time for speeches. Sharif was back in Pakistan after 4 years, so the expectations were huge. Thousands of people had gathered to hear him speak. But there was one bit of drama left. The dove release. That's right. At one point, a dove sat on Nawaz Sharif's outstretched arm. He released it before speaking. It sums up the tone of his comeback. Sharif's speech was about a man wronged by the system, a leader persecuted and now freed like a dove. It's a narrative that sells everywhere. Just one problem though. Sharif is back in Pakistan because of the same system. We'll discuss that in a bit in detail. But first, listen to what Nawaz Sharif had to say.
बेरोजगारियां हो, गुर्बत हो, बीमारियां हो, जहालत हो, ये नवाज शरीफ चाहते हैं। ये नवाज शरीफ चाहते हैं और मेरी दुआ है अल्लाह ताला से, अल्लाह ताला मेरे दिल के अंदर।
In other words, he just wants to help Pakistan, he says. He's not looking for revenge. Yet his biggest political rival is still in jail. That's Imran Khan. Today he was indicted in yet another case, that of leaking a secret diplomatic document. The hearing will begin on Friday. If convicted, things look really bad for Imran Khan. The charge carries up to 14 years in jail. In the worst case scenario, it could also result in the death penalty. But frankly, this indictment was expected. The army wanted to lock Imran Khan away for as long as possible. That's why they struck a deal with the Sharifs to keep Imran Khan out. And in return, Nawaz Sharif got a ticket back home. He was convicted and disqualified in a corruption case, but in 2019 he left for London. Medical reasons, apparently. Either way, he never came back. Pakistani authorities should have arrested him on his return, but last week he got judicial protection, meaning the court said no arrest. As for his disqualification, it still remains, but chances are not for long. Pakistan's elections are slated for early next year. Nawaz Sharif wants to be Prime Minister after that, so expect more judicial help soon, something that could make him eligible to contest the election. Now, such political deals are not new in Pakistan. Even Imran Khan struck one with the army. And before that, Nawaz Sharif did. It's a cycle, really. But do they actually change anything? Do they affect domestic and foreign policy? And Sharif did talk about foreign relations. He said, you can't prosper if you keep fighting with your neighbors.
किस तरह अपने हमसायों के साथ और दुनिया के साथ अपने ताल्लुकात को उस्तवार करना होगा। हम अपना हमसायों के साथ लड़ाई करके दुनिया के साथ अच्छा ताल्लुक करके तरक्की नहीं कर सकते। हमें सबके साथ अच्छे ताल्लुकात कायम करना होंगे।
He did not take India's name, but the message was clear. Pakistan needs better relations with its neighbors, whether it's India or Afghanistan. It's a strange message, though, because reaching out to India is not really a populist strategy in Pakistan. So why is Nawaz Sharif doing it? Could the army have asked him to send such a message, or is this a personal objective? Because Nawaz Sharif has engaged with India in the past. He's one of the few leaders who put in a lot of effort in this direction. He also has a record of blindsiding the army, but right now it's too early to tell really, because Nawaz Sharif still needs the army to gain power. Without them, he could join Imran Khan in jail. And whatever the reason, Sharif was surprisingly honest during his speech. At one point, he also praised Bangladesh. Again, that's not really a populist pitch. Nawaz Sharif said Bangladesh is far ahead of Pakistan. Listen in.
आज वही मशरकी पाकिस्तान तरक्की में आपसे आगे निकल गया है। आगे हम पीछे रह गए हैं। पीछे ये हमें मंजूर नहीं है।
What does all of this mean? It's too early to say. So let's keep foreign policy out for the moment. Instead, let's focus on Pakistan's domestic challenges. Does Nawaz Sharif have a plan for them? If he does, he hasn't shared it. His speech was high on rhetoric and promises, but low on substance. Pakistan's economic crisis needs specific solutions, not outlandish claims. Their inflation is more than 31%. 4 out of 10 Pakistanis are living in poverty. Words will not solve this problem. Only a solid policy will. And time is running out because every day the headlines keep getting worse. The latest one is about Pakistan's flag carrier, the PIA, Pakistan International Airlines, PIA. On Sunday, 77 of their flights had to be cancelled. 77 PIA flights had to be cancelled. Do you know why? Because they could not pay for fuel. Pakistan's state oil company cut off the airlines. They said, first clear your dues. Now, this is embarrassing for any country, but with Pakistan, you always saw it coming. The PIA has been bleeding money over the years. The government is looking to sell it off. They want a private player to turn the PIA around. We say good luck to them. You can't build an economy without sound policies. You also can't build it if your prime ministers don't even last 5 years. Consistency, you see, is key to progress. And Pakistan has never had it. Sharif's comeback is not a break away from that problem. It is only a symptom of it. Our next story is from the South China Sea. We often say the next war could be fought here, and not without reason. Let me tell you what happened over the weekend. 2 ships collided, one Chinese and the second from the Philippines. It was a dangerous collision and it was captured on camera. Take a look.
Nabidyohan ko po, nabidyohan ko.
You saw what happened there. A Chinese vessel ramming into a Philippine Coast Guard ship. At least 2 such collisions were reported, and Manila blames Beijing for this. Specifically, they blame the Chinese militia. They're an extension of the Chinese state, the Chinese militia, and China uses this militia to enforce its claims on the South China Sea. In recent months, they have stepped up such operations. China has become more aggressive. It's been involved in many tense encounters. Chinese ships have bumped into Philippine vessels. The PLA has fired water cannons on them. They've even tried to intercept ships. And the Chinese Coast Guard has been making threats. Take a look at this video now.
Your champagne is locked. Your champagne is not allowed. Entered reefs. Tell them, leave immediately. Tell them, leave immediately.
Leave immediately. So wawa po eh.
Your activity, your any activity, in this water is illegal. It's not allowed.
Ya buat orang umum. Awak dia ambil.
This video is from last month. A Filipino boat was at the Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese Coast Guard was there too. They threatened the Filipinos. The Scarborough Shoal is part of the South China Sea, as you would know. The Philippines claims it, but China controls it. And it blocks the access of others. First, China gives verbal warnings. When they're ignored, Chinese ships make provocative moves. They bump into ships from the Philippines. Do you know how many times this has happened? At least 55 times. 55 times this year alone. So today, Manila summoned the Chinese ambassador. It registered a formal protest. It said China is targeting its ships intentionally.
The National Task Force West Philippine Sea, led by National Security Advisor Secretary Eduardo M. Año, condemned in the strongest degree the latest dangerous, irresponsible, and illegal blocking maneuvers of the China Coast Guard in concert with the Chinese maritime militia yesterday morning that caused it to collide with the Philippine resupply boat Unaisa May 2.
But diplomatic protests do not help. Beijing pays no attention to them because it doesn't recognize Manila's claims. Let me also explain where all of this is happening. This is the South China Sea. It is a massive region spread across 3.6 million square kilometers. It has over 250 islands, atolls, cays, shoals, reefs. China stakes claim to 90% of this area, 90%. It says 90% of this area is Chinese. And this is a controversial claim, if not an outright lie. It has no basis in fact or law. 5 other regional players have competing claims: the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and Taiwan. Their claims overlap with China's. But Beijing refuses to acknowledge them. In 2016, the Philippines went to court, to an international tribunal, and the result was this. The court ruled in Manila's favor. It said China's claims have no basis. That's what the court said. Guess what China did? It rejected the verdict, and it decided to double down. Instead of dropping its false claims, China began deploying its military. It started encircling the atolls and building artificial islands. Islands large enough to host tankers and warships. Some of them have been militarized, complete with airfields and defense equipment. And now it is resorting to coercion, threatening ships from the Philippines, trying to keep them away by force. Manila has a term for these tactics. It says China is using quote-unquote brute force. In response, Manila has also launched a counter-campaign. It sends ships with cameras. It encourages journalists to report from these disputed waters. The idea is to capture China's activities on video and broadcast these clips to the world. Of course, Beijing does not like it. It accuses Manila of running a smear campaign.
China once again urges the Philippines to take China's solemn concerns seriously and honor its commitment and stop creating tensions at sea. Stop taking dangerous actions, stop attacking and smearing China, and tow away the naval vessels illegally grounded as soon as possible. This will avoid undermining peace and stability in the South China Sea.
China says it will, quote-unquote, protect its sovereignty, and that means more dangerous encounters on the high seas. Manila's tactics have exposed China's coercion, but this strategy is like a double-edged sword. If they push China too far, they risk an escalation and a bigger face-off that all sides can ill afford. As we speak, India is celebrating a 9-day festival. It is called Navratri, a grand carnival of dance, music and worship. In the state of Gujarat, this includes all-nighters of Garba, a joyful style of dance. But this year, Garba nights have turned into a nightmare. Within a span of 24 hours, at least 10 people have reportedly died of heart attacks at Garba events. The youngest victim was a teenager. It's scary. And it looks worse when you zoom out. The world over, there are about 18 million cases of heart diseases, 18 million. India contributes to at least 1/5 of them. Over the last 3 decades, deaths from heart diseases have surged 60% globally. What is causing this rise? Our next report tells you.
Navratri is an auspicious and colourful festival celebrated in India. It's spread over 9 days. In the state of Gujarat, it's hard to tell the difference between the Garba Fever and the Navratri fervour. Garba is a joyful dance style. But what happens when Garba nights quickly turn into nightmares? Within the first 6 days of celebrations this year in Gujarat, reports say the 108 emergency ambulance services in Gujarat received 521 calls for heart-related issues and an additional 609 calls for breathlessness. But that's not the worst of it. Within a span of 24 hours between the 7th and 8th day, that's October 21st and 22nd, over 500 ambulance calls were made. All of them for heart-related issues. But that's not the worst of it. At least 10 people died of heart attacks. The youngest victim was just 17 years old. Some died while playing Garba, others on their way back home after the dance. Big numbers over very few days and all from one state. The question is, why? Doctors claim the biggest factor is sudden overexertion amid an overall poor lifestyle. Garba nights full of energy often involve some hectic dance moves. Many of the dancers are also on a fast. But the biggest concern is the overall poor lifestyle. It's leading to health problems, and things are only getting worse with each passing year. Over a quarter of Indians are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. About 11% are diabetic and 15% are pre-diabetic. Meaning India has 101 million people living with diabetes. Between 2019 and 2021, 31 million Indians became diabetic. And that's not all. 36% of Indians suffer from hypertension. Over 50% of them are obese. The annual increase of obesity is very high. It stands at 5.2%. So the risk of getting a heart disease has shot up exponentially. According to the World Health Organization, there are over 17.9 million cardiovascular deaths across the world every year. India contributes to at least 1/5 of them. But India is not the only one suffering. Deaths from cardiovascular disease have surged 60% globally over the last 3 decades. Obesity, diabetes and hypertension don't just increase the risk of heart disease, but also stroke. Stroke is the leading cause of disability worldwide. It's the second leading cause of death. Today, 1 in 4 people is likely to have a stroke. Reports say that by 2050, global stroke deaths could rise by 50%. Both heart disease and stroke were considered common among the elderly, but that's no longer the case. Today, even the young are vulnerable, and it was abundantly clear in Gujarat. When young people die of heart attacks while dancing at a festival, you know that it's a wake-up call.
What happens when you treat foreign policy like a board game? You become Justin Trudeau. It's been a month since he accused India of killing a Khalistani. Since then, a lot has happened, and he's not given proof yet. The latest episode was last week. Around 40 Canadian diplomats left India. Ottawa was enraged. They accused India of being unethical and unreasonable. They also called it a violation of the Vienna Convention. India rejected all of that. New Delhi's position was based on diplomatic parity. You have 10 diplomats in my country, I have 10 diplomats in your country. That's parity. If not exactly the same number, then at least close. But in Canada's case, it was not even close. They had around 61 diplomats in India. New Delhi had just 20 in Canada. And it wasn't just about the number. It was also about what these Canadian diplomats were up to. Listen to India's foreign minister.
Parity is very much provided for by the Vienna Convention, which is the relevant international rule on this. But in our case, we invoked parity because we had concerns about continuous interference in our affairs by Canadian personnel. We haven't made much of that public. My sense is over a period of time, more stuff will come out and people will understand why we had the kind of discomfort with many of them which we did.
Interference. That is India's accusation against Canada. Now, this diplomatic tussle will hurt people on both sides. Canada has stopped visa services at 3 locations. They warned of a backlog. India stopped visa services last month itself. New Delhi cited security issues. If diplomats cannot go to work, how can they approve visas? Hence the suspension. But India's foreign minister also emphasized that this was temporary. If things improve, visa services could resume. In fact, Minister Jaishankar said he was hoping for it.
We stopped issuing visas in Canada. Because it was no longer safe for our diplomats to go to work to issue visas. So their safety and security was the primary reason we had to temporarily stop the issue of visas. Because as you know, ensuring safety and security of diplomats is the most fundamental aspect of the Vienna Convention. If we see progress there, I would like very much to resume the issue of visas.
So now it's up to Justin Trudeau. He's like that losing gambler at the casino. He made a massive bet. He thought he had the right cards, but then his fortunes changed. Trudeau has 2 options now. A, he can cut his losses and leave the game, or B, he can gamble some more. If he chooses option B, the risk is obvious. Because Trudeau is not just gambling with money, he's gambling with political capital. And for leaders, that's more important than money. Right now, everything Trudeau does is backfiring, not just with India, but everything. He recently visited a mosque in Toronto. He was reaching out to Canada's Muslims after Israel's attack on Gaza. In normal circumstances, that should be fine. But when you've just offered unconditional support to Israel, maybe not. Take a look at how the people reacted.
How many more Palestinian children need to be slaughtered? How many more before you call for a ceasefire?
Boo! Boo!
That's 6,500 under the rubble. 2,000 children. Shame on you. This man won't even call for a ceasefire to stop the slaughter of Palestinian women, children, and men. Shame, shame. Don't use your giving card, Mustard. Don't invite it.
Don't on one side.
So he was booed there. And just to be clear, we're not questioning Trudeau's Israel policy. We're questioning his methods, his timing. The same thing that he said about India. Trudeau could have easily discussed this issue privately. He could have handled it diplomatically. Instead, he made a spectacle out of it. And the Canadian opposition is loving it. Their leader, Pierre Poilievre, has questioned Trudeau's India policy. And this weekend, he doubled down. Let me quote from what he said. This is the Canadian opposition leader. He's talking about Justin Trudeau. He says he's so incompetent and unprofessional that we are now in major disputes with every major power in the world, and that includes India. And that's the charitable part. The rest is even worse. Let me quote again. Beijing is interfering in our country, opening police stations in Canada. Justin Trudeau is considered a laughing stock in India. President Biden is walking all over Trudeau and treating him like a doormat and slapping him around like a rag doll. These are the words of the leader of Canada's opposition. Polls say he could be the next Prime Minister of the country, and he says Trudeau's handling of India is wrong. But is the Prime Minister listening? He's accusing India of violating basic diplomatic principles. That doesn't sound like a de-escalation to me. What happens next is entirely in Trudeau's hands. He started this needless conflict. He can end it as well. And if he doesn't, his people will at the polling booths. And now let's turn our attention to Argentina. Against all odds, the incumbent government had a good weekend, and the anti-establishment challenger faced a setback. Argentina went to polls yesterday. Millions voted. The country is economically crippled. It has seen triple-digit inflation in recent months. Against this backdrop, the election happened. The results came out last night, and the ruling party came out on top. Their candidate was their economy minister, Sergio Massa. He's running for president. And he was leading at the end of the night. His biggest challenger is Javier Milei. He's also called the Argentine Trump, because just like Donald Trump, he's considered controversial and outsider. But unlike Trump, he's not won the election. Although it's not over yet, a runoff will take place next month. Our next report tells you why the world is watching this election so closely.
Millions of Argentinians took to the ballot box yesterday. They cast their vote for the next president. There were three main contenders. The ruling party's candidate, Sergio Massa, a traditional conservative and former Minister of Security, Patricia Bullrich, and then there was the radical outsider candidate, Javier Milei. Milei has overturned politics in Argentina. It's no longer business as usual. Milei is known to pose with chainsaws, saying he'll burn down the existing political system. And that message has an appeal. Argentina is at a crossroads. The country has been struggling. A crumbling economy and runaway inflation have been hurting Argentinians. 2 out of 5 people are now below the poverty line. It's the perfect storm, one that was supposed to help sweep out the ruling party. But surprisingly, the opposite has happened. Sergio Massa, the incumbent economy minister, is leading in the polls. Yesterday's results have thrown the presidential race wide open. The night ended with Massa in the lead. He's won over 36% of the vote. This is despite inflation touching triple digits under his watch. Massa became the economy minister last year. He was brought in to steady a sinking ship. He hasn't succeeded yet, but he has gained popularity with his latest move, an end to income tax. Massa made that move last month, and it seemed to have paid electoral dividends, but not enough to take him over the line in the first attempt. A candidate needed 45% of the votes to win the president's post yesterday, and Massa got only 36%.
There are still 30 days left. On November 19th, we have to define if we conclude a country that embraces everyone or the country of every man for himself. I will embrace each Argentine regardless of what they think.
Massa has to fight a runoff election against the outsider challenger Javier Milei. That's him singing, "I am the king, I will destroy you." He's a former rock band member and an economist as well. Milei is an unusual candidate to say the least. He's known for his impassioned speeches sprinkled with foul language. His solutions for Argentina's problems seem to involve a lot of destruction. Milei wants to scrap Argentina's embattled currency, the peso, and replace it with the US dollar. He also wants to burn down Argentina's central bank, to end taxes and government programs. He's called for unregulated gun ownership, an open market for trading human organs, and a complete ban on abortion. Milei has also opposed COVID quarantines and attacked scientists. He's been called an extreme libertarian, a far-right populist, and the Argentine Donald Trump. He too is gearing up for the second round of the presidential race.
We were robbed of the ballots in 5,000 polling stations. Therefore, this epic battle continues because even so, they could not defeat us.
Milei has already blamed election fraud for the first round results. His rhetoric has been divisive and combative. Massa and the incumbent government are likely to have a fight on their hands on November 19th, and the aftermath will decide the future of Argentina.
The year was 1981. Ronald Reagan had become the US president, and lore goes, one small boy was outraged over this. He saw the news on TV and he exclaimed, "He can't be president, he's a man." Not the reaction one would expect, right? Well, this boy belonged to Iceland. And at that time, the country, Iceland, was being ruled by a woman. This woman, Vigdis Finnbogadóttir. She was divorced and a single mother. In 1980, she had become Iceland's president. Now, what the boy did not know was this. Vigdis was Europe's first female president and the first democratically elected female president in the whole world. She was not the norm, she was the outlier. And she was president for 16 years. Thanks to her, many Icelanders grew up believing that being president was also a woman's job. That's rare even today. Vigdis attributed this to the events of one particular day in her country, the Women's Day Off. It was held on 24th October 1975. That's when 90% of the women in Iceland went on strike. They refused to go to work, to cook, to clean, or to look after children, to do anything basically, all for just one day. And the nation was brought to a standstill because women refused to work. It changed the way women were seen in that country. Women flooded the streets to rally for equal rights with men. In 1975, Icelandic women made 40% less than what men made. Today, that number is just about 9%. That's the pay gap, the lowest in the world. But they're not happy. They say, "You call this equality?" In fact, this is their official slogan, "You call this equality?" And they're going on a protest again tomorrow. History is about to repeat itself. About half a century since the OG strike that created shockwaves, tens of thousands of women across Iceland will take to the streets again. This time they have a singular agenda: equal pay. Women will stop all work, both paid and unpaid, tomorrow. And this time they'll be joined by non-binary people, people who do not identify as male or female. The strikers will include fishing workers, teachers, nurses, even the Prime Minister of the country, Catering Jacobsdóttir. She's joining the strike. Now, this is both ironic and a lesson for all, everyone in the world. And I'll tell you why. Iceland is a global leader on gender equality. It tops the global gender gap rankings. And it has done so for 14 consecutive years, meaning it has the least gender pay disparity the world over, yet it wants to do better. But in other countries, things are not so good. Iceland is followed by Norway, Finland, New Zealand, Sweden, Germany, Nicaragua. All of these countries have a pay disparity below 20%, which looks bad, but these are the top performers. In some countries, the situation is much worse, like in Pakistan, Iran, Algeria, Chad, where women earn 43% lesser than men. This is followed by Mali. And where does India stand? India has a pay gap of 36%. In China, it's 33%. In the US, it is 26%. I could go on, but you get the point. People may still say gender pay gap is a myth. If women had $1 for every time someone said this, they would be able to make up the pay gap. Because it is not a myth. It is our reality, stubborn and pervasive. More than 3 billion people are said to be employed worldwide. Out of these, more than 1 billion are female. But worldwide, women make only 77 cents for every dollar earned by men. And that's 1 billion people being robbed on a daily basis. What's worse, this pay gap has barely improved in the last 20 years. It may have hit a glass ceiling of its own. Equal work with unequal pay should be abnormal, not the norm. Icelanders see this. So they are pulling out all the stops. and bringing their nation to a halt. We say kudos to them. And finally, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Storm Babette brought strong winds to Scotland. They lifted the forest floors, making it seem like the floors were breathing. In a breath of fresh air, the same storm covered the UK's coast with sea foam, and dogs seemed to love this. Meanwhile, Mexico's streets are filled with walking, talking skeletons celebrating the Day of the Dead festival. And what happens when you can't choose between Halloween and Navratri festivities? You can show up as characters of a horror movie to a Garba night. And finally, taking you back in history to the year 1983, on October 23rd, Hezbollah attacked American troops stationed in Lebanon. It was a suicide bomb explosion. 241 US service members were killed. This was the deadliest day for American Marines since the Second World War. In the aftermath, US forces were withdrawn from Lebanon. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.